Afternoon, guys. Welcome into my channel. So today we're gonna continue our lecture with Azure AZ305, designing Microsoft Azure infrastructure. So the lesson we're gonna be lecturing today is Azure governance. Now, by the way, let's just talk about understanding landing zone. So a landing zone is the basic building block of any cloud adoption environment. The term landing zone refers to an environment that being provisioned and prepared to host workloads in a cloud environment like Azure. A fully functioning landing zone is the final deliverable of any iteration of the cloud adoption. So with landing zone, we have compute, network, storage, data. So now with compute and network, we have management group, resource, primitive, naming standard, and subscription design. Storage and data, you have cost, policy, governance, monitoring, and identity. Now, Azure governance define governance is the framework that determines how your organization conducts business activities from objectives and responsibilities. Azure governance combines different services and capabilities, allowing for managing all your Azure resources at scale and following control guidelines. So, just a second. Let's just continue with the next slide. So, what we have here is how governance structure in Azure. You have migrate, govern, configure, secure, protect, and monitor. Now, govern resources in Azure. Let's first thing first. Governance is the process that we use to maintain control over all of our applications and all of our resources and Azure. Now, governance itself is a very broad term. It involves determining your requirements, planning all of your initiative in Azure, and settings all of our strategic principles. The core elements to governance will be these management group. Management group. Is management group. So we have two management group listed on the slides. One is tenant group. This always exists by default. So every Azure subscription has a tenant group created with it. You can create additional management group depending on what your need actually are. Then you have subscription group. We may have one more subscriptions within our environment. Every time you create a resource has to reside on a resource group. Now, so that so that goes back to something like creating a new virtual machine. Should I put this in a new resource group, or should I go into an existing resource group? An existing resource group, question mark. Now, a lot of considerations go into how you should actually design that. And lastly, we have the individual resource. So I'll have virtual networks. I could have SQL databases. You have your Windows or Linux virtual machines, just the individual component themselves that actually create with Azure. Something as simple as creating a virtual machine, create a virtual machine, in it takes about 2 minutes or so. You just go through and fill in some values. Then it creates a virtual machine for you. But a lot of considerations have go to into that when you create a virtual machine. Are you going to have it create a new virtual network? Are you going to have it create a new storage, or are you going to use existing storage? Are you going to use existing disk, or are you going to create new disk? So these are the questions that have to come in mind when you about to create a new virtual machine in Azure. A lot of things into that. Will it be created under an existing resource group, or are you plan to create a new resource group? So lots of those type of consideration or have to be made, and ideally all of these have been answered well before you create a resource group. So our primary goal in governance is to be a structure laid out that dictates which resource will be grouped together. So ideally, we will already have a structure in place that will define management group. Back to this again. Subscription, resource group, and resources. So at the time I go to create a virtual machine, this structure should have already been into place and already have been defined. So we just know this is going to go into the resource group, or I'm going to create a new resource group. I'll be created on the subscription, or on the subscription one, or on the subscription two. This is extremely important, guys. Many of these things are so simple, like like we reference creating a virtual machine in about 1 or 2 minutes. Well, the downside to that, if you create a virtual machine and put it in the under an existing resource group, maybe you should have created a new resource group for it. Maybe they are part of the same life cycle. It's very easy and fast to do many of these things, but if they are not playing well, it can extremely difficult to manage and rework this after the fact. So this front-end planning is very crucial when deal with governance resources in Azure. Thank you so very much for following along with me. So stay tuned. We're going to have a lots of lecture and demos. So again, thank you for following along with me. I'll see you in the next lecture.